So this morning we're going to be looking at here shortly Isaiah chapter 53. We've already come to 53 chapters, 53 weeks of this incredible prophet Isaiah and just learning about what he has to say. And as we come to chapter 53, this is quite a well-known chapter, a very well-known chapter. And this is one that really highlights the idea of Israel and Jesus Christ as a servant. In the past few weeks, we've looked at Isaiah's chapters 49 and chapters 50, and those have also been chapters that pointed to Jesus Christ and the nation of Israel and God's continued people in the church as servants. These have been chapters that point to Jesus Christ himself, the Messiah, as the fulfillment of Israel's purpose, the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. These are chapters that point to Israel that were in their present context and their role, but at the same time, they have another deeper layer of pointing to that coming Messiah. That these aren't passages that point to either Israel or either Jesus Christ, but they point to both. And they point to Jesus as the fulfillment. And they also point to the role of the church as God's people all over the world who are continuing to be called to be the servant of God, to point people to who he is. So Isaiah chapter 53, as we come to it, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is it's just a very profound and specific and a very prophetic chapter, a very prophetic passage about the servant. And it really, I'm going to read from it shortly, it's really one that you'll see that the New Testament gospel writers and the letter writers drew from, that Paul drew from, and those other incredible teachers who also wrote letters in the New Testament. And it truly reveals Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of Israel. These words that I'm going to read in Isaiah chapter 53, they clearly link the role of Israel with Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ, 5.5 centuries after these words were written, after these words were spoken to the people of Israel coming out of exile, that Jesus Christ fulfilled these words specifically as that one person. In the same way that Israel was in general and in a more broad way called to fulfill their role as a servant, Jesus Christ specifically fills that role. So let me read, and I'm actually going to start at the end of chapter 52, starting at verse 13, and then I'm going to read the rest of the chapter of chapter 53. So this morning, let me start Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13, and I'll read to the end of chapter 52. So this is what the prophet Isaiah said. See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. This points to the call of Israel. So as the prophet Isaiah was sharing this to the people of Israel as they were coming out of exile, this is how the Israelites, the Jewish people, would have heard it. A description of Israel's role, a description of Israel's history for their present time. They would have had this understanding of Israel described as if it were a person, as if Israel were personified. I mean, as we look at the end of chapter 52, verses 13 to 15, we have the idea of God lifting Israel up, lifting up the nation of Israel, despite their marred and their broken and their often perceived weak and even their, in a sense, defeated appearance, that through all of that God will lift them up and exalt them. As you look at chapter 53 and verses 1 through 3, we have a sense of the history of Israel, that God brought them out of nothing. That still others, the surrounding nations, didn't think much of Israel. They had a history of slavery in Egypt. They had a history of other nations invading and conquering and making war against them and mocking them. Even as we've looked at the prophet Isaiah, we've studied how Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, and the Babylonian Empire have interacted with Israel, treating them as nothing. Even just several weeks ago, we looked at Isaiah chapter 41, and even in that chapter, God calls Israel a worm and an insect, and that was in chapter 41, verse 14. But he didn't say it to mock them or to make fun of them, but to just provide an analogy to describe them, to describe their seemingly insignificant heritage, especially in the world's eyes, that God brought them out of nothing to make them into a great people for him. As we look further on in chapter 53 and verses 4 to 6, we get the idea of the exile of Israel. That these are verses that speak to Israel's necessary defeat and their exile due to their sins, their constant disobedience to God, that the nation of Israel as a whole would bear this burden of their sin, even as there were probably some within Israel, a remnant of faithful Israel that still sought to seek after God. Nonetheless, Israel would still bear the sin and the consequences of them. Verses 7 to 9 continue to speak of this exile, a sense that they may have had a sense of injustice at being exiled, at being conquered, a sense of injustice, a sense of it being unfair, of being cut off and sent away from their promised land. And then as we finish chapter 53 in verses 10 through 12, we get the sense that even with that sense of unfairness and injustice that the people may have felt, the exile was still a necessary result. It was still a necessary consequence for Israel's disobedience. It was required for their atonement as a nation. It was required for their making up for the sin and their disobedience and rebelliousness to God. In a sense that once that was over, that God would allow them to return to him, to return to that promised land of Israel in Jerusalem. So that's kind of a sense of how Isaiah's contemporaries would have heard it as Isaiah shares this. But that's one layer. But as we continue, there's also a deeper layer that this points to an actual person. That in a general abstract sense, we have here the personification of Israel, but in a very prophetic and real sense, it also points to the real and specific person, that deeper layer of this passage. And that points to the specific fulfillment of it in Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And it makes this passage all that more powerful to consider it on both this contemporary level that Isaiah's contemporaries would have heard it in, and also the future prophetic level that they would have heard it in as well. This points to the personification of Jesus Christ. We think of the birth and the life and the death of Jesus. As we read this passage, it's clear that it points to him. I mean, the details in this passage are just too specific that they can't be ignored. That it points to Jesus Christ. And it further makes the case that Jesus is that specific fulfillment of Israel, the servant personified as an actual person, in a real and historical person, 5.5 centuries after this passage was written. And again, it points to the case that Jesus really fulfills Israel's call. Verses 13 to 15 at the end of chapter 52, we have the exalted Christ that despite his vicious beating and his flogging and the whipping that he took by the Romans, the skin that was ripped from his body as he was whipped, the excruciating suffering and the torture that he took in his crucifixion. Yet this nobody who they thought that they were beating was actually the true king of all creation, the true king who all worldly kings and emperors and leaders and whoever else, they will one day bow down before Jesus Christ in recognition of who he truly is, in recognition of their own humility and their own fragile humanity before the God of all creation. That Jesus Christ, as we start to look at chapter 53 and verses 1 through 3, that he was a tradesman. He was a carpenter who was born in Bethlehem, a small town. He was raised in Nazareth, the place, the town that had the running joke of the time. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? See that in John chapter 1. But in verses 4 to 6, we see in Jesus Christ the one who willingly took upon himself our sin out of love, and he went to the cross. He was willing to be that atoning sacrifice for all people, for you, for me. He was willing to be an atoning sacrifice for those who haven't even recognized him. And Jesus was one who went to the cross and died this crucifixion out of love. And it wasn't because God was angry at him. It wasn't because God was angry at Jesus Christ. He didn't have wrath towards Jesus Christ himself, his own son, the second person of himself. But he did this out of love for people and for creation. That God knew that him going to the cross was the only way that this reconciliation and restoration could happen with that relationship, because he knew that he could not do this. That we could not do this on our own. This was not something that we as sinful creatures were capable of. But to atone for the sin of all of humanity, it was something that only God can do, and only God can do as fully representative of himself, God, and fully representative of all of humanity, which is why Jesus Christ came as a full human, as a full man, both fully God, fully man. This was an act of love by Jesus Christ. There was wrath, there was anger, but again, it wasn't directed at Jesus Christ. It was directed at sin itself. That wrath, that anger, was directed at what sin had done to creation and humanity and people. But out of love, God took that upon himself so that this relationship could be restored. That was the legitimate sacrificial love of Jesus Christ on behalf of humanity and the creation. So we see the verse, by his bruises we are healed. This isn't a verse that calls for physical healing specifically, but it's a verse that says that we are healed of sin and sin's effects because of the bruises that Jesus Christ took. Because of the bruises that God himself took as the second person of the Trinitarian God, that he took out of love for us. As we continue on in chapter 53, and as you look at verses 7 through 9, once again, Jesus Christ knew that this was not necessarily a just thing that was happening to him, especially in our sense of justice. Think of the idea of a sinless man suffering for the sins of others. And it was unjust in the sense of the false pretenses of his trial and his crucifixion. But Jesus Christ, God himself, knew the greater picture of what was happening and knew that this had to be done for that greater justice of restoration and reconciliation. And he took this worldly injustice upon himself because of his love. And this is an example of the grace of God, to be willing to take on something that he did not deserve as an example of love for others who did deserve those consequences of sin, for ourselves who deserved it, that Jesus Christ took that from us and put it upon himself in his sacrifice. That Jesus Christ became that ultimate and that final sacrifice for humanity's rebellious sin. And Jesus Christ was crucified and died. That he was cut off from the land of the living. That he was buried in a tomb of the rich, but still buried among other sinners, even buried among those who may have been corrupt themselves. And he was there with them, despite his own sinless nature. In verses 10 through 12, we see that role of Jesus Christ, to be that servant of God, that true servant, to be an atoning and an ultimate and a final sacrifice for all of humanity's history, throughout all of history, throughout all of time, that Jesus would take this upon himself out of love so that we may be restored in relationship to God. This is just such an incredible passage. All these servant passages are so incredible, and they point to the role of Israel at their time, but they also point to the role of Jesus specifically and his love. This provides such meaning and such commentary and such interpretation of who Jesus is 5.5 centuries before he lived, before his birth and his death and his resurrection. As we look at the calling of these servant passages, except especially chapter 53, upon Israel and what it meant for Israel. It meant that through Israel and their example, humanity was meant to learn about God and to have relationship with God. And then through Jesus Christ, this passage fulfilled in a real, historical, actual person, and not an abstract person of Israel, but a real person representing Israel and humanity. Jesus Christ fulfilled it, allowing all people to have relationship with God, allowing all people to experience that love and that forgiveness, and to be made whole and restored and reconciled. That Jesus Christ made the calling of Israel a possibility for the entire world. In Jesus Christ, will you respond to that act of love that he has done? Will you respond to the calling that God has put upon your life, whatever that may be? How will you respond to Jesus' act of sacrificial love, to God's act of sacrificial love, to God's act of servanthood for you, for the creation, for humanity? Now, as I was thinking about this passage and just the application for us today, I think the first application is a sense of response. How do we respond to the calling upon Israel and to Jesus, and now the church, God's continued calling upon people to be a part of his family? But there's also the realization that none of us can replace Christ. None of us can do what Christ did. Only he could do that. That we cannot take on that weight of sin in the same way that Jesus did. We cannot atone for it ourselves. Only Jesus can do that. That we cannot take these things upon ourselves that only Christ, as fully God, fully human, and sinless, could do. Only Jesus Christ could do that on behalf of humanity and on behalf of God at the same time. But the good news is that we don't have to replace Christ in that. Only Christ can do that, but we can then go to Christ in response to that, in response to his sacrificial act and his taking of sin upon himself. And that's something that applies to all of humanity throughout all of history. We just have to recognize what he has done. We just have to be willing to have faith in him and to respond and to walk in the path that he's called us to do. And in love, we can help point and guide others to that. But in a very real way, though we cannot take the burden of sin upon ourselves, only Christ can do that, we can still follow Christ's example of servant and sacrificial love. It's the calling that Israel had. It's the calling that Jesus fulfilled. And now it's the calling of the church. This passage very much applies to us in the same way that it applied to the nation of Israel. That we can be a people who share the burdens of others, who share the sacrifice. That we can be willing to bear the burdens of others and ease the burdens of others. It's something that is done in sacrificial love. And it also reveals the very real love of Jesus Christ to others. It shows in a very real way what Jesus has done. I want to read this morning just a verse from Galatians chapter 6, what Paul wrote to the church in Galatia. This is what he said. He said in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, "My friends, if anyone is detected in a transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. Take care that you yourselves are not tempted." And then he says this, "Bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." There are burdens that each one of us carry. The burdens of sin, the burdens of transgressions, they are very real burdens. In grace and in love and in forgiveness and in pointing to Jesus Christ, those burdens are eased. And we can learn to live in God's holiness and his sanctification and his salvation. Sometimes we feel like those burdens of sin are gone overnight, that God takes them away from us overnight, but sometimes that sanctification can also be a process that takes months and sometimes even years before those burdens are eased completely. We have to continue to pray and lift one another up and continue to seek after God and his Spirit and Jesus Christ in the meantime, as often as we can. But we also carry burdens, additional burdens that can weigh us down, emotional or physical or mental or financial or medical, family, friends, stress. That list goes on. I'm sure each one of you can think of what that may be. You can probably think of the burdens in your own lives that you carry that may fit into one of these categories. But in the spirit of Isaiah 53 and the call that these servant passages have upon Israel to carry burdens, the fulfillment it finds in Jesus Christ, who carries our ultimate burden, the one that we ultimately just cannot carry, that will crush us, that burden of sin. Jesus carries that burden. But we as the church are called to help and ease and carry other burdens of people in the same way, the same sense. This is the call to love our neighbor and to make that love real in a tangible way. Through the crisis care kits that we're doing, through the child sponsorship that we're doing, these are very real and tangible ways that we're helping to ease burdens that people suddenly find themselves with. But how do we truly carry and share those burdens? I want to share an illustration. As I was thinking about this passage and praying about this passage, I was reminded of something that we did while I was still a cadet in Army ROTC, and it was part of our physical training program. And it was something that we called log PT, or log physical training. So let me just describe to you what log PT is, log physical training. It's when we would have this giant railroad tie of a log, this giant heavy railroad tie of a log, and we had to do all these different exercises with it. We'd have to do sit-ups with this log. We'd have to carry it or jog with it or walk with it over a certain distance. We'd have to be willing to take this log and just lift it over our heads repeatedly. There was even a time we did an entire Army obstacle course with this log, and we couldn't finish the obstacle course unless we brought this log with us. But it's something that had to be done as a team. It's something that could not be done alone. It was impossible. It'd be impossible for one person to carry this huge, heavy log alone. It was a very real and a very physical weight and a very physical burden that we bear with one another in order to complete whatever we would have to do with it. Whatever those burdens are that we have today, they can be impossible to deal with on our own. Again, mental, emotional, physical, medical, family, financial, even the temptation of sin and transgressions. We can ease the burdens of others, as Paul calls us to do, by being God's people together. This is the call that God has upon us as a church, and is part of the call that God had upon Israel in these servant passages. It doesn't mean it has to be fair in bearing these burdens together. Isaiah chapter 53 shows that bearing the burden of one another is not something that's necessarily meant to be fair by the world's standards. But we are called to help when and where we can, and even be challenged to sacrifice when we do that. Just because I was and my team were lifting a giant heavy log over our heads repeatedly, or going through an obstacle course with this, it never meant it was something that ever became easy. It was still very difficult and challenging. But we do it together. And to bear those burdens as a church together is something that is an act of love on behalf of all people. And it doesn't mean that any one of us have to be perfect in that. I'm not perfect. No one's perfect in this. But we help each other despite our imperfections. One of the things I brought with me this morning is this kettlebell. This is a 40-pound kettlebell. Let's see if I can get a better view of it on the virtual. I'll put it down right here. This is a 40-pound kettlebell that I train with, and I use it because it's part of one of the 6 activities in what is now the Army Combat Fitness Test. And this activity is within the span of 3 minutes, or as quickly as you can, but within the span of 3 minutes or less, you have to do a 50-meter sprint, a 50-meter, 50-meter, 90-pound sled drag, then a 50-meter lateral shuffle. Then you have to carry 2 of these kettlebells for another 50 meters, so 80 pounds total carrying these kettlebells, and then another 50-meter sprint. And when I did this, this was one of the activities that definitely wore me out the most. So I have here the one kettlebell, 40-pound kettlebell, and I have here the other 40-pound kettlebell. And you're carrying these along, just walking with them or running with them. And you can imagine the burden that these would take. And it's only for 50 meters, but if you had to continue to carry it, your arms would just continue to get more and more tired. You couldn't just keep on going forever with these weights and these burdens. You'd eventually have to put them down and to rest. Imagine all the burdens that we carry. The mental burdens, the emotional burdens, the physical burdens, the medical, the financial, the stress sometimes of family and friends, and the dealing with sin and transgressions and our mistakes and our past and our worries. Imagine these burdens as these kettlebells, as these 40-pound kettlebells that you're just constantly carrying. And as we carry them more, we just start to walk more and more slowly. You may be able to run at first with them, but eventually you're going to slow down. And eventually you're going to have to take breaks. And eventually you're just going to have to stop. Maybe some people might be able to carry it longer than others. But all the same, you're going to have to stop eventually and rest and take a break. And eventually you're just not going to want to carry them anymore. That's not something that's sustainable to just continue to carry on our own. Now, with the weight of sin that's on our hearts, if you would imagine one of these kettlebells as that weight of sin, Jesus takes that weight and he just takes it from you. And he does that in forgiveness. And we no longer have to pick that weight up. Jesus takes that weight away from us. Sometimes we want to pick it back up. Sometimes we do pick it back up. But Jesus said, just put that back down. You don't need to carry that anymore. You don't need to deal with this kettlebell, this weight any longer. But then we have the weight of the other things in our lives. And as Paul calls the church to do, we are called to bear those things with one another. With the weight of all the other stuff of life, Jesus helps carry that with us. Jesus even may carry it for us. But as the church, together as God's people, as the body of Christ, we are called to carry that with one another in love. That weight becomes easier. If it's 80 pounds of 2 kettlebells of weights that we're carrying over 2 people, that weight becomes 40 pounds a person. That burden becomes a little bit easier. An act of sacrifice, yes, but we carry it together, and we can lift one another up and encourage one another in that burden. If there are 3 people carrying these 80 pounds, it becomes 26, 27 pounds a person. With 4 people carrying, it's 20 pounds a person. With 5 people, 16 pounds a person. And 6 people, 13 and a third pounds per person. You get the picture. The more people who help carry these burdens together, the less that weight becomes for each of us. And it just becomes a little bit easier. Like carrying a big, heavy log over an entire obstacle course becomes easier with a team of people rather than just doing it with 1 or 2 people. Now, I also understand that it can be a challenge for us to be willing to open up and share these burdens with others that we carry. It can be easy to want to try to hide this weight, but it's still clear that we're carrying it. We have to be willing to open up and share these burdens with others, and not to keep them to ourselves, not to want to just continue to hold on to them ourselves out of a sense of maybe even shame or guilt or embarrassment. But in that same sense, it also becomes the challenge for us to accept and bear these burdens with one another, whatever they may be, and to share them with another in love and in grace and in forgiveness and in sacrifice. And in the example that Isaiah provides in chapter 53 and the other sermon passages for Israel, in the example of Christ fulfilling and personifying that servanthood in a real historical person. God provides a challenge for his people in Isaiah chapter 53. For Israel, as Isaiah's contemporaries would have heard it, as Isaiah shared this with them at his own time, there was a description of their role and who they are to be, to bear that burden and that sin. And in bearing that, to atone and once again become the people of God. These sermon passages, especially chapter 53, it's also a call that is fulfilled in the very real person of Jesus Christ, fulfilling Israel's role and call. But in that, it's also a call that's continued in the church today, continued in the church since the time of Jesus Christ, to follow that example of Christ in bearing the burden and sacrifice with one another. It's part of what it means to be a part of God's family. Jesus Christ, as he fulfills Isaiah 53, he takes the burden of sin that we have, that none of us can carry on our own. He takes that burden of sin in a powerful and a profound way. And it's something that God has done in an incredible act of love. But God also calls us in this chapter as the people of God to continue to be a servant, to be willing to bear one another's burdens in love and in sacrifice. That's the challenge for us in this chapter, to go to God with these burdens, whatever they may be. If they're burdens that we can give to him, then give them to him. Sin and transgression, just give them to him. But also a challenge for us to be willing to carry burdens with one another as the church. What burdens, what weights, what kettlebells have you been carrying that you just can't carry anymore, that you need to share with others? And maybe ask yourself too, how can I help carry the burdens that others have? How can I come alongside someone and carry this with them? And in this way fulfill the call of Jesus Christ upon his church to also be that servant of God, to be the body of Christ.